Happy Sunday, everybody. I hope you've all been enjoying Standard as we're coming to the close of Duskborn. So usually what I do is I do my budget decks after Foundations has actually released. And this time I'm gonna just mix it up a little bit. I'm gonna talk about kind of how the budget decks are looking going into Foundations, and then we'll kind of revisit the budget lists after we get the changes, after we get some time playing with the new cards from Foundations. So these are all relatively well-performing archetypes that I think will continue to be a thing unless there's a dramatic shift in the meta. And so one thing to keep in mind if you are new and returning to Magic the Gathering is to craft with care, right? It's usually a good idea to kind of wait for a week or two until you invest in some of the more expensive upgrades with like mythics and rare wildcards. Now, these decks are all relatively cheap to craft, right? So we've got these are all my budget lists. I keep myself to just commons and uncommons, so they're a little bit lower risk to craft, right? If it ends up being a bad deck, then you're not out a whole bunch of resources. So the other thing that I like to do is I'll present the kind of upgraded version of the deck. If you craft the budget deck and then like it, that would be, I'll tell you, I'll give you my crafting guide for how to upgrade them into their most competitive version. And again, every Monday I go over my best of one, best of three meta review. This week, because Foundations is coming out on Tuesday, as is usual, we'll be skipping it. But I'll be back the following Monday to kind of talk about how Foundations has affected the meta. So with that ramble and intro, let's get started. So I think the top performing budget list that you can craft, with just commons and uncommons, is mono red aggro, and the core of the deck is definitely centered around the Heartfire hero. You can enable this core better with the Manifold Mouse, as we'll talk about in the upgrades. But this has been a very impressive card, especially if you were targeting it with early combat tricks to trigger its Valiant. So very, very good. Definitely been impressed with it. Cacophony Scamp, on the other hand, is sort of like the Heartfire hero. It has better synergies in Rakdos aggro, where you're going to fling it for triple times its power, as we'll also get into. So it's a good one to craft because it does see play in other archetypes. And it does synergize well with, putting a Bane Splitter on it still allows you to hit in and then blow it up to deal twice its power. And you're always going to be a little bit limited when you're talking about strictly keeping it to uncommons and commons. So you've also got the shocks and the lightning strikes, which you can hit for your opponent directly, or you can pop your opponent's creatures. Swift Spear works well with all of the prowess synergies, all of the non-creature spells. Bane Splitter triggers it, Might of the Meek, etc. Might of the Meek gives you the card draw, which allows you to kind of keep from running out of gas, right? Demonic Ruckus, you can plot this and then use it as a way to target the Heartfire hero, helps you get around blockers as well. And then the Cunning Coyote allows you to give haste to your Heartfire hero and your Cacophony Scamp, and I've been seeing some mono red lists exploring this over the Screaming Nemesis, and fits pretty well into the archetype. And then the Witchstalker Frenzy is in here for bigger problematic blockers like Shieldred in Golgari midrange, for example. And then you've got Rockface Village in here to trigger the Valiant off of Heartfire hero. Now, there's a couple of different versions of the upgraded mono red aggro list, and so this one is the list from Worlds, from the World Championship, adapted into best of one, getting rid of the sideboard. So sorry, I couldn't remember how to command to sort the rares and mythics for a while there. My brain was having some issues. So the main upgrades are for the mice package, and you've got the Manifold Mouse, which works really well with the Valiant on the Heartfire hero, being able to give it double strike, getting it bigger every single turn. Emberheart Challenger also has the Valiant and gives you additional dig in this deck, helps you find additional resources. And then Hired Claw is a really great one-drop and is second, I think, or maybe even actually a better one-drop than Heartfire Hero, depending on if you have the Manifold Mouse in hand, right? Because of being able to threaten in, because you can make this into a 2/3 after it attacks, and makes it kind of a problematic blocker, problematic creature to block. And Then the Screaming Nemesis, as I mentioned, was involved in Worlds. This one's really great for on the draw, being able to block your opponent's plays. And if you want to see this deck, I did a gameplay video without a camera on, which I've been exploring. And I've been very impressed with this deck. It's been working well. I think, I'll probably use it to climb into Mythic in Best of 1 this season. So the rest of the deck is very similar to what we saw in the budget build, keeping the interactions and the combat trick, dropping the Might of the Meek, but quite a few similarities. I don't know what's going on with this. Look at this. What is going on? Always some bugs in the software. All right, so the second one that I want to talk about here is Mardu Aggro, which is very similar to Boros Auras and works pretty well in the budget space. So again, only commons and uncommons here. And you're still leaning off of the Heartfire hero, but you're bringing in the second best budget option, which is the Sheltered by Ghosts. This card just wins you the game sometimes if you can play it down on turn 2 on a 1-drop, right? So you have 3 different 1-drop options to then hit with your Sheltered Ghosts. The Ward 2 then makes it difficult for your opponent to interact with that, especially because they do stack. If you have multiple copies of Sheltered by Ghosts, they have to play or pay multiple copies of Ward. And then we're throwing in the Callous Sellsword. You don't have to run the Callous Sellsword version. You can just lean fully into the red-white option. Note, no black lands, because all we're doing is playing this for the Burn Together to be able to fling to deal double damage to your opponent. But it has nice synergies, being able to deal triple the power of Heartfire Hero. And we'll talk about, again, Rakdos Aggro, which is leaning more heavily or more fully into that archetype. Then we just have a whole bunch of enchantments that help the Optimistic Scavenger, like put +1/+1 counters on things. So we've got Ethereal Armor, we've got the Feather of Flight, we've got the Demonic Ruckus, and Monstrous Rage, although it's an instant, does put a enchantment monster roll on the creature that you target, so it also triggers an enchantment coming into play. And bringing in the white allows you to kind of have a little bit better of an interaction against your opponent's single point removal, where you can hold up the Shard Mage's Rescue so that when you go to play the Sheltered by Ghosts, you can protect the target from getting blown up and getting 2-for-1 with the Shard Mage's Rescue. And then Atali's Favor in here is just something that I think as a budget option is pretty good. We see some lists include it, some lists not include it, but because of all of this, basically your one dead hit is Callous Sellsword, and that's a pretty good place to be. So, Braided Bluffs works okay for, the red-white space. The downside to mono red is that you're going to have less consistencies in the mana, and so having the dual lands is nice, and this is an option at common, but as you'll see, you're definitely going to want to focus on upgrading the lands to make this deck perform better, as you would with any 2-color deck. All right, so in Boros Auras, we see the mouse package, which Manifold Mouse and Emberheart Challenger in here to trigger the Heartfire hero. You will see some lists running a full copy of the Manifold Mouse, some not. And then you'll also see some lists running the Slickshot Show-Off. And this one works better in the Mardu or the Rakdos Aggro strategy, being able to fling your opponent. So the more that you're leaning into the Callous Sellswords, the more likely you're going to see the Slickshot Show-Off, because you can turn 3 your opponent by playing 2 cards that give this creature at least 2 power, giving it 9 power, and then you fling it. It gets the +2/+0 from casting the Burn Together, and you hit for 20. So there's a lot of really fast strategies that you can turn 3 wins and such that you can get with this deck, and Rakdos Aggro leaning more heavily into that strategy. But this is kind of a blend of Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras, and I've found it to work quite well. This is what I used to hit Mythic last season. And as far as the lands go, Battlefield Forge and Inspiring Vantage, I know nobody likes to craft the lands. I highly recommend that you craft the lands if you are a beginner, because they go into more decks than these do. These also are good options. They will improve the overall power level of your deck, but the consistency that you get in mana is actually going to be, I think, arguably a greater impact on actually making the deck perform well. So, and then also you get to play them later in other decks once Boros or Mardu Aggro kind of goes away. The third top performing budget deck is Selesnya Auras, or white green Auras. And this one is leaning on the Sheltered by Ghosts and away from the Heartfire Hero, but has some really good options in the budget space with Admirer, and Tomocool Honor Guard, both of which have Ward, which on top of the Ward with the Sheltered by Ghosts means that you don't have to have the Shard Mage's Rescue up as much to make sure that these are actually getting targeted by your Sheltered by Ghosts. And so you're still playing, a couple of 1-drops to be able to get that turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, and that just basically takes away the game from your opponent. Especially as you can make it into something that they just can't afford to block with the Ethereal Armor. And it's very similar to the strategy that I just talked about in red-white enchantments. And but we've got some options in green that we don't have in red. So Audacity gives you trample, so that they can't just chump block your really big Voltron, is sometimes referred to, because you're putting all of the things on one card. Sometimes referred to as Voltron. Royal Treatment also gives you additional ward and gives you that hexproof for a turn, so it's like having multiple copies of the Shard Mage's Rescue, which makes it more resilient against the single point removal of black. And Hunter's Talent is in here. This one is just a budget option. It's not really played in the upgraded lists, but it kind of similar to Audacity is giving you that additional trample, and then the level 3 chapter of it gives you some card draw if it does go into the later part of the curve. And we actually have decent fixing in green-white, and because you don't need to start on turn 1 into turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, you can kind of play it a little bit slower, especially if you're going to be keeping up the Royal Treatment or the Shard Mage's Rescue. You can afford to play a large amount of tap lands, which better helps you have the kind of better cope with the increased mana variance of running almost a 50-50 split between green and white. As far as the upgrades go for this one, we see 2 copies of the Innkeeper's Talent. This is another one that does see play in Gruul aggro in best of 3. But it's it's an enchantment, so it's got nice synergies with the other enchantment cards. And then we have Calyx, and this is really the payoff for being in white-green as opposed to blue-white or red-white or any of the Sheltered by Ghosts themes, right? Black-white. They all have a version of the Sheltered by Ghosts deck, and so Calyx allows you to then copy the Sheltered by Ghosts and your Audacities and your other enchantments, and is a pretty nice payoff for being in in white-green. And then we have fixing because you don't need to start with the tap lands, right? But if you can, you have more pressure and you're better suited for getting around your opponent's interaction, especially if you start on the play. Because then they're relying on like cut down and they just can't pave through the board, and it really just leaves your opponent with no response outside of a sweeper like Temporary Lockdown or Deadly Cover Up or Sunfall. So the lands, again, very important. You will see these being played in other archetypes, and I think they are a pretty important craft, right? So this is only seeing play in this deck at the moment. This one a little bit more, and then these 3 would be my first crafts if I liked the white-green archetype. And now back to the Heartfire Hero decks. So basically, like I said, the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts are really your best options at budget. So they're kind of different variations of the same theme. And because, one of the things, too, for budget players that's kind of, I think, frustrating is that there aren't really great mid-range and control options in common and uncommon, right? Like you have really good interaction, right? You could take like mono black mid-range's core, and you have all of the interaction you need. You just are missing the win con, right? And so you're kind of limited to some strategies that mostly aggro, right? But we do have some budget options that aren't aggro, which we'll get to. So this one is Rakdos aggro. This was the one that's leaning the most heavily into the Callous Sellsword. You have a plethora of 1-drop options, especially in the common and uncommon. And so like you've got Cacophony Scamp and Heartfire Hero that are going to pop off and fling for the triple damage, and this is just leaning really heavily into that strategy specifically. So a lot of the same core that we talked about in mono red, still things to improve the power and such. Dreadmaw's Ire gives us a little bit of the trample to get over a problematic blocker, and we've got a little bit of shock here for interacting with our opponent and stopping the reverse strategy. And this deck definitely took a hit, right? This was the deck that was doing quite well with the Leyline Resonance, which got banned in Best of 1. But the deck is still there. You just don't have the turn 2 win off of the Cacophony Scamp, or yeah, I think it was off the Cacophony Scamp at a turn inside out with the Leyline Resonance, which duplicated it. But anyway, you still have turn 3 options with a Slickshot Show-Off, like I mentioned, being able to hit it with a Felonious Rage or a Dreadmaw's Ire. You then sacrifice this, deals the 20 damage to your opponent. The Emberheart Challenger in here, just for a little bit of dig if you need it. We're not leaning fully into the Manifold Mouse strategy or the mouse package here, and instead bringing in the Urabrask's Forge, which can kind of give the deck a little bit more of a late game reach. And again, there's different variations of the upgraded decks that you will see. I'm just going off of the ones that were doing quite well as of this morning. And so not every Rakdos aggro list is running the Urabrask's Forge, but especially if you're going to play in Best of 3, it's a good option to craft, usually being a sideboarded card in Best of 3. And there's other decks out there too, like the Selesnya Rabbits deck, which does have a budget list. I just haven't gotten the budget list to perform as well as I would like. And so I'm trying to stick more to some of the budget lists that have worked for me, and I think you can use to get daily wins, and then go from there, right? So let me know if you've checked these budget lists out and if they kind of missed the mark or if they did well. Always love to hear back from you guys. And so this one's number 5, and this is our first non-aggro strategy. So this one is a budget build of Dimir Poison. And Dimir Poison is a very friendly budget strategy, and you don't have to have any creatures. So it makes a lot of the mono black decks that are leaning heavily on interaction get punished for that, because all of those destroy target creatures don't have a target. And then what you're doing is you're giving them poison counters directly through like Vraska's Fall, Infectious Inquiry, one more, the blue draw, where is it? Prologue to Phyresis, all gives your opponent a poison counter straight up. And then afterwards, you can then use any of those cards that have Proliferate to give them an additional poison counter. And once they reach 10 poison counters, they die. Is how you win the game. And then you've got some things like some corrupted payoffs, like Bring the Ending and Anoint with Affliction, which do better once your opponent is actually corrupted. Experimental Augury gives you that Proliferate and good dig. Serum Snare for bounce and Proliferate. And card draw off of the Distorted Curiosity becomes, for 1 blue, becomes a very nice cheap option once that's happening. And again, I included some common mana fixers for the blue-black space. Again, you can improve upon this with the rares like we'll talk about here shortly. And you can see this one is entirely lands. That's all it is, right? So there's a couple things to talk about, though, about why, like, for example, this one's including 4 copies of the Billows Skull Dweller, right? Well, if you include more of these fast lands and lands that aren't necessarily, that are not going to be tapped on turn 1, it then allows you to run a lower land count. A lot of times you'll notice the budget build has a larger amount of lands than the upgraded list, right? So when you upgrade your lands, it also allows you to play more of your non-land cards, right? So again, I don't know how many times I have to I always try to stress this, is just how important crafting lands is to making your deck perform well. So so yeah, we run a shorter amount of lands because we have the rares, and then also dropped 1 Vraska's Fall to bring in the 4 copies of the Skull Dweller, right? And which allows you to sometimes get 1 or 2 toxic counters off of the creature. And cards like this, tapped unless it's early. This one is just straight up tapped, but it comes with a Surveil, which then helps improve your draws throughout the game. This one, untapped, but at the price of life. And then Mirix giving you additional 1/1 tokens that can push toxic damage if you're in a very controlling, grindy matchup. Definitely helps this archetype out. All right, now we're going to swing back to the Sheltered by Ghosts kind of archetype, and this one performing a little bit worse than the green-white and the white-red options because you don't have as many turn 1 targets that then hit with the Sheltered by Ghosts. So this one is taking a little bit more of a mid-range approach, really kind of stressing getting the Sheltered by Ghosts down once the creature can be protected by something like Shard Mage's Rescue or Faithlight, and then increasing the amount of just general 1/1s off of cards like the Grand Entryway and the Gremlin Tamer, which spawns a bunch of 1/1s. Inquisitive Glimmer is a nice one as a payoff for being in white-blue, because then it makes all of your enchantments cost 1 less to cast. And Bottomless Pool is a pretty good tempo strategy, being able to bounce something of your opponent's and then late game flip it up into something that gives you additional dig. It's a pretty good budget option. And then the Faithlight, I think, is really one of the points of being white-blue, is that you get an additional Shard Mage's Rescue, but instead of Feather of Flight, which you'll see a lot of times in Boros auras and sometimes in Azorius or white-blue auras, this gives you the hexproof along with giving you the +1/+0 in flying, right? So if you have access to blue, I think it's just a better version than Feather of Flight. It doesn't give you the card draw, though. So little pros and cons, right? And then we have removal with ossification. Some people have explored the Trapped in the Screen. I think it works pretty well as a replacement to ossification, but this is a little bit cheaper. So against the aggro heavy best of 1 meta, I'm going to lean towards the ossification. And here's the upgraded version of it, and you can see that like this one is running Feather of Flight instead, which is, it's a fine option. Gives you more card draw, which this deck is leaning a little bit more into, giving you some more additional... the card draw allows you to go deeper into the game and not run out of resources. So Entity Tracker, whenever you play an enchantment, you draw a card, and then the Silent Hall Creeper, whenever it deals damage, well, one time when it deals damage, it draws a card, gives you a little bit of that card draw. And I know, really well spoken. But the core of the deck is very similar, and then not running the Bottomless Pool, but bringing in the card draw instead, and bringing in the fixing that gives you the untapped fixing like the Darker Wastes, the Pain Lands, the Verge Lands, which are pretty excellent in white-blue, and then the Seachrome Coast, which again gives you the untapped unless it's later on in the game. And then number 7 here is Mono Black Discard. And Mono Black Discard works a little bit better for the budget strategies because the win condition is at uncommon. You could run a Mono Black mid-range deck. The problem is having that mid-range threat like Shieldred or something like that is generally a mythic or a rare. Bandit's Talent, on the other hand, is an uncommon, and as long as you are playing the attrition strategy of trading 1 for 1 with your opponent's stuff, eventually you're going to get to that point where your opponent is losing 2 life off of the second chapter, and then the third chapter allows you to draw additional, so you can continue to answer your opponent's cards 1 for 1. So this is a pretty key card for getting the budget deck to work. The rest of it is just interaction, and you can kind of pick and choose, like, do you want 1 copy of Shoot the Sheriff and 1 copy of Bitter Triumph, or do you want 2 copies of Bitter Triumph, or do you want to ditch them all to go for 4 copies of Shieldred's Edict? Kind of your choice, right? I like a little bit of a spread myself, and I do like the 4 copies of Cut Down and the 4 copies of Go for the Throat. There's not a whole lot of artifact creatures that are punishing having the 4 copies of Go for the Throat in the meta right now. Deep Cavern Bat is also uncommon and allows us to disrupt our opponent's hand. Same with the Duress, and there's not a very heavy creature-only list like there was in the previous, before rotation, and actually during Bloomburrow, we had a fair amount of creature-only lists like the Selesnya Rabbits, which have kind of fallen out of popularity despite still doing pretty well on the ladder. But right now, most of the time I'm bumping into Mono Red Aggro and Boros Auras, and Duress then giving you a pretty good target. Even the Mono Black Discard Mirror Match, you can use Duress to remove your other opponent's interaction if you want to. But the Hopeless Nightmare makes them discard, same with the Ruthless Negotiation. And yeah, you're basically just trying to get your opponent out of cards and answer everything that they play. It is a very creature-centric strategy in the sense that, like, if they're playing a strategy like Dimir Poison, you're going to have a lot of dead cards in hand. Same with other control strategies or mill strategies. So this one doesn't perform ultimately. It has some tough matchups on the ladder, which the higher up the ladder you go, the more likely you're going to bump into those problematic matchups, which then kind of make this deck fall apart. But it is a decent budget option, especially for just getting those kind of early wins or daily wins, and while you're building your collection. And Thoughtstalker Warlock also allows us to attack your opponent's hand, and the Demolition Field is in here for answering problematic man lands if this deck can struggle against a like Golgari mid-range's 4/4 that's going to come at you every turn. So throwing in a little bit of Demolition Field is a nice option since it is an uncommon. And this is also another one that has a lot of different flavors as far as like what you're going to bring in for. Like some will include Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal for the lifelink. Others will be leaning into multiple copies of Shieldred. Sometimes there's only 2 copies of Shieldred and other threats. This is the one that has worked the best for me. And the Wrinkles Prank I really like. It's an Edict and a Mind Rot in one card. So you don't want to lean too heavily into it because you also have to be sacrificing creatures and discarding cards. But it works well enough in the trading 1-for-1 with your resources with your opponent. Liliana of the Veil being an edict as well as a repeatable discard outlet is definitely helping this strategy perform quite well. And then we have the Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket allows us to replay some of the creatures that we have killed with our early interaction with Cut Down and Go for the Throat. And you can see we ditched a lot of the interaction to bring in some more threats. And that's generally what you're going to see in the upgraded lists is moving it more towards a mid-range deck instead of strictly leaning off of the bandit's talent. Because if they have Destroy Enchantment or Counterspell, like then mono black discard can kind of struggle to close. But giving you alternative ways to kind of seal out the game then helps improve the strategy. So, and this list was not running the Demolition Fields. Some lists do, some lists don't. So you could also just run the budget list that I showcased earlier without the Demolition Fields. And there you go. So there's the 7 budget decks and their upgrades. I hope that helps you kind of, explore some options and what you can do as a beginner if you have a limited amount of wildcards, because they are relatively stingy with these, right? The wildcard resources, you have to play a lot to get a large amount of them. So I've been playing Arena since, for the last 3 years, pretty much daily. And free to play for the most part. I did spend about $100 or $200 now to do draft on Twitch. But if I wasn't trying to do this as like a content creation, I was free to play for a long time. And so you can play Magic for free. You either pay with money or you pay with time. But with the budget options, you can hopefully get some wins and grind those dailies to then get into a competitive deck and get to that point where you can play multiple decks in kind of a single ladder climb and really enjoy all that Standard has to offer. So again, if you're new here, welcome to my community. I do meta reviews every Monday, and I do some off-meta stuff on Sundays, and playing around with doing some faceless, just gameplay videos to kind of show you guys my ladder climb up to Mythic. I'm not the best Magic player in the world and never have claimed to be, so they're not, if you're the best player in the world, they're a little bit more successful to do those gameplay videos. But I had some requests to try it out, so I'm exploring that area. And you can always catch me on Twitch, although I've stopped streaming Monday through Friday and now kind of have a real job. So my schedule has yet to really find a solid rhythm yet. But you can drop me a follow on Twitch and come say hi. Always love seeing you guys from YouTube. And yeah, I think that's my rant. So I'll be back to talk about budget lists at some point for Foundations and what has been performing well and kind of slots into these archetypes, and if we see any new ones. So take care, everybody. Have fun with Foundations, and I'll catch you later.